The man Camille Thornton was divorcing had a secret. 11 months later, she would discover it had cost him everything. She didn't know that yet. Camille had built a billion-dollar company from a studio apartment in Fremont using a laptop, a prepaid phone plan, and the kind of stubborn refusal to fail that only develops after a person has already lost everything once. She had not lost everything in a long time. That was about to change. It was 9:47 on a Tuesday night. Camille was walking back from the executive washroom on the 14th floor of Thornton Dynamics headquarters, heels quiet on polished concrete, the office nearly empty at this hour. She was 3 hours from flying to New York. 12 hours from sitting across a conference table from the attorney who would finalize her divorce. Then she heard Julian's voice behind a closed door. Not his phone voice. Not the careful, measured tone he had perfected over the last year of their marriage. This was something lower. Something stripped of every pretense she had grown used to hearing from him. "Liquidate the final asset tonight," he said. "Every remaining position. Wire everything to the Cayman account by 6 a.m. Camille stood in the hallway with her hand 2 inches from the door handle. She did not push it open. She stood perfectly still and listened to the silence that followed, and felt something crystallize behind her sternum. Cold. Precise. Terrible. She turned around. Walked back to her office. Sat down at her desk with the city of Seattle burning orange beyond the windows. And told herself she had just heard exactly what she thought she had heard. She was completely, catastrophically wrong. To understand what Camille believed she had discovered, you need to understand the year that had just passed. The specific kind of distance that had moved into their marriage. The quiet that arrives the way water moves into a wall, invisibly, slowly, until the damage is already structural. Julian Thornton was not the man most people expected Camille to have married. He was not a founder. Not a disruptor. Not the kind of person who walked into rooms and rearranged the air. He was a landscape architect who read history books and cooked elaborate Sunday dinners and was genuinely, effortlessly kind to strangers in a way that Camille had once found disarming. And had gradually, without noticing, started to find small. Over the last 3 years, she had redefined an industry. Over the last 3 years, Julian had been there. Quiet. Present. Making no demand she could measure or account for. She had started to see his steadiness as passivity. His loyalty as comfort-seeking. His refusal to compete with her success as evidence he had nothing left to compete with. She had filed for divorce 6 weeks ago. There were things she had noticed in the weeks before that filing. Things she had told herself had innocent explanations. The old family photograph of Julian's parents, the one that had stood on his desk for as long as she had known him, disappeared one morning. She assumed he was redecorating. She did not ask. The piano. His mother's concert grand, 40 years old, handpicked by a woman who believed music was the one thing money couldn't manufacture. It had stood in the corner of their living room since they moved in. 1 week it was there. The next it was gone. Julian told her it was being restored. She believed him because it was easier than asking the next question. The late phone calls. The night she caught him near the window, voice too low to hear, expression carrying something she couldn't name. She assumed it was business. She went to bed. Once, at 3 a.m., she had woken to the sound of him in the kitchen. She stood in the doorway. He was sitting at the table with his phone face down, staring at nothing. When he saw her, he said, "Couldn't sleep." She nodded and went back to bed. She hadn't asked. She was already leaving. What was the point? None of those moments made sense to her then. They would all make sense later. At the worst possible time. Now, sitting at her desk after midnight, she opened monitoring software she had never expected to use on her own husband, and started finding things that should not exist. A secondary email account, dormant for 11 months, suddenly active in the last 72 hours. Encrypted messages to a number she didn't recognize. A wire transfer history running through 3 different holding companies to an account in the Cayman Islands. and a file on his personal laptop, accessed from their home network for days ago, that carried the name of her company's most vulnerable upcoming acquisition. Camille sat in her office and watched her marriage become something unrecognizable. The man she had decided was too passive to be worth saving was apparently not passive at all. He had been watching, planning, moving money and information with a precision that looked nothing like the man she thought she knew. She called her attorney. She called Marin. She told them what she had found and told them to proceed with the morning filing. Then she walked to the elevator, rode it to the lobby, and stepped into the car that would take her to the airport. She did not call Julian. She told herself she had caught him just in time. Here is what Camille did not know. 11 months earlier, Julian had received a phone call from a man named Conrad Blackwell. The name meant nothing to him. The information Blackwell carried meant everything. Roland Pierce had been Camille's mentor before he became her enemy. A business titan who had taken a 26-year-old entrepreneur under his wing, taught her the architecture of power, opened every door she needed. And then, when she discovered that the foundation of his empire rested on a decade of fraud, bribery, and the deliberate destruction of smaller companies who had dared to compete, she had reported him. The investigation had taken 2 years. Roland's companies collapsed. His fortune was largely seized. His reputation reduced to a single word that followed him everywhere: disgraced. Roland Pierce had spent the years since then building something else. Not a company. A mechanism. Blackwell laid it out for Julian in a parking garage on Capitol Hill at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. The plan was elegant and devastating. Roland had spent a decade placing people inside Thornton dynamics. Not visibly. Not in ways that would trigger standard security protocols. But in positions that, in coordination, could move proprietary information, falsify financial records, manufacture evidence of misconduct, and trigger a federal investigation that would bury Camille's company and Camille herself. The plan was fully operational. And it had been designed with a single, brutal trigger condition. The moment Camille became aware of it, the attack would begin. It was built like a dead man switch. Knowledge was the key. The second she learned Roland was coming, simultaneous attacks would fire from multiple directions, faster than any legal or security response could contain. Blackwell was not there to negotiate. He was there to deliver a message on Roland's behalf. Julian could watch it happen. Or he could help slow it down. "What does he want from me?" Julian asked. Blackwell told him. Julian drove home and sat in the kitchen of the house he shared with his wife, the house that had been full of warmth once and had gone quiet in a way he didn't fully understand, and he made the decision that would cost him everything. He would not tell Camille. Not because he didn't trust her. Because he did. Because he knew exactly what she would do with the information: confront it, fight it, go public, and because going public was exactly what Roland had built the mechanism to answer. Every instinct that had made Camille successful would accelerate her destruction. The only way to protect her was to keep her in the dark. Buy time. Find Roland's people inside the company without triggering the switch. Build a counter-operation quiet enough to dismantle the mechanism before it could fire. To do that, Julian needed money. Not his salary. Not their shared accounts, which Roland would be watching. He needed liquidity that couldn't be traced back to Camille, that couldn't be leveraged against the company. He used his inheritance first. His grandmother's estate, which had passed to him 8 months earlier. Gone in 60 days, sold quietly, without paperwork that could surface in the wrong hands. His investment portfolio. His retirement accounts. The family property in Oregon that had been in his family for 40 years. The photograph of his parents. The one Camille had noticed missing and said nothing about. Gone because the frame had contained a provenance document for a private sale she was never supposed to know had happened. And the piano. His mother's concert grand. The thing she had left him because she said he was the only person in the family who understood that some things were too valuable to keep in a house where they might be overlooked. Julian sold it to a music school in Portland for $40,000. He transferred the money. He did not sleep. At 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, he sat at the kitchen table and typed a message to Camille. He read it twice. He deleted it. He thought about what it would feel like to tell her. To watch her face when she understood. To be the person she ran toward instead of the one she was already walking away from. He put the phone down and went back to work. Every asset. Every reserve. Every piece of his family's legacy. All funneled through holding companies into the operation that would keep her alive. And none of it, could be explained to Camille without pulling the trigger on everything he was trying to prevent. So he had become exactly what she feared he was. The phone call she overheard was real. The offshore account was real. The financial movements were real. Every piece of evidence she had found on that screen was real. And every piece of it existed to save her. There were nights he almost told her. He would stand outside their bedroom door for a moment longer than necessary, his hand on the frame, running through the calculus one more time. Every time, the math came out the same. He would turn around and go back to work. There were nights he sat in the car in the parking garage at headquarters for 20 minutes before he could make himself go inside and pretend that everything was normal. He was losing her anyway. He knew that. Somewhere in the middle of the operation, watching her grow colder and more distant, he had accepted that the divorce was probably going to happen regardless. That keeping her alive and keeping her with him were two separate problems, and he had only enough left to solve one of them. He had chosen the one that mattered. Camille landed in New York at 6 a.m. By 7, her name was on a court filing that publicly accused her husband of financial misconduct and theft of proprietary information. By 9, 3 financial news outlets had picked it up. By 10, Julian's phone was ringing with calls from people who had known him for years and were no longer certain they did. By noon, the damage was the kind that doesn't easily repair. His landscape firm's primary investor pulled a funding commitment. 2 active projects went on hold. His business partner called and said, with genuine sorrow, that he didn't know what to say. Julian did not defend himself publicly. He continued the operation. Because the clock was now running. The public filing had made noise. Roland's people inside Thornton Dynamics would hear it. If Julian could not complete the counter-operation in the next 72 hours, the dead man switch would fire regardless, and Camille would face both the consequences of his exposure and the full force of Roland's attack simultaneously. 72 hours. Almost no resources remaining. He sold the last thing he had left. The thing he had been saving, telling himself he wouldn't need to reach it, right up until the moment he did. The Cayman account was never where he hid stolen money. It was where he hid the cost of saving her. On the 48th hour, Nolan Mercer's team made contact with Declan Reeves, an investigative journalist who had been tracking Roland Pierce for 3 years and was 3 months from publishing a story he couldn't quite finish because the final piece kept disappearing. Julian gave him the final piece. Everything. The mechanism. The names. The account trails. The evidence of Roland's placements inside Thornton Dynamics and the coordinated financial operation that would have destroyed a company of 400 people because a disgraced man had never learned how to stop needing to win. Reeves published 48 hours later. Roland Pierce was arrested in his Palm Beach apartment at 6 a.m. on a Friday. Conrad Blackwell was arrested the same morning in Seattle. For Thornton Dynamics employees were placed on administrative leave pending federal investigation. The company's stock dropped 11 points before recovering 19 by close of market when the full story became clear. Camille was in her New York hotel room when she read the article. She read it 3 times. The 4th time, she stopped at a paragraph near the bottom. A source familiar with the counter-operation, the journalist had written, described the individual who had financed and coordinated the effort as someone who had liquidated every personal asset over the preceding 11 months. Inheritance. Real estate. Investments. Personal savings. The source declined to be identified but described this individual's motivation in a single sentence. He said he couldn't let her lose the thing she'd spent her life building. Camille sat with her phone in her hands for a long time. She thought about the piano. How she had noticed it missing and said nothing because she was already leaving. How easy it had been to assume the worst about a man she had already decided wasn't worth understanding. She thought about the photograph. The late phone calls. The 3 a.m. kitchen. The tired eye she had read as guilt and never once considered might be grief. She thought about every closed door she had walked past in the last year. She had stood in every doorway of his suffering and walked away from all of them. She flew back to Seattle that night. Julian was at the kitchen table when she came home. He hadn't moved in what looked like several hours. The house was dim, quiet, the way a house gets when someone has been sitting alone in it for too long. He looked up. Camille had spent 12 hours on planes and in airports preparing for this conversation. She had assembled language. Organized the accounting of what she knew now against what she had believed. She had come ready. None of it came out. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "Because you would have fought it," he said. And fighting it was what he designed it to wait for. "You could have found another way." "I looked for 2 weeks," he said. There wasn't one. She sat down across from him. The table between them had once seated 8 for Sunday dinners she had stopped coming home for. Now it held just the two of them and the specific quality of silence that belongs to people who have run out of defenses. "You lost everything," she said. "I lost things," he said. "Not everything." She looked at him. At the man she had decided was too small for the life she was building. At the person who had spent a year in a kind of solitary, unwitnessed courage that she would not have believed him capable of, because she had stopped believing he was capable of much at all. She had written the story of who he was before she had understood who he was. "I called you small," she said quietly. "And you were carrying my whole life by yourself." Julian was quiet for a long moment. "There were nights I almost told you," he said. "I'd stand outside the bedroom and run through it one more time. Every time it came out the same." He paused. "I was losing you anyway. I knew that. I just decided that losing you alive was better than the alternative." The room held that sentence for a long time. Camille put her face in her hands. And for the first time in longer than she could measure, she did not hold herself together. Julian did not move to fix it. He sat across from her and let her feel all of it. The way you sit beside someone who is finally allowing themselves to break, not because you want them to suffer, but because you understand that the breaking is the beginning of something. Outside, Seattle was gray and wet and ordinary. Inside, the house held two people who had been circling each other in their separate silences, one carrying a secret that would have destroyed her, one carrying the story of a man she had stopped trying to read before she reached the last page. The divorce filing was withdrawn 2 weeks later. The legal process was quiet, administrative, conducted without press. Julian rebuilt slowly. The landscape firm recovered one project, then another. The investor who had pulled funding returned, with an apology that Julian accepted without fanfare. The piano was gone. He did not talk about it often. Camille did not go back to what they had been before. She went forward to something she had not known to want. Something that required her, for the first time in her adult life, to consider the possibility that the people who moved quietly beside her success were not diminished by it. They were, sometimes, the reason it survived at all. On a Sunday evening 3 months later, she came home to find Julian in the living room. He had moved a chair to the corner where the piano used to stand. He was reading. The room looked different without it there, a specific kind of absence that you notice more as time passes, not less. She stood in the doorway. "I want to replace it," she said. Julian looked up. "Not the same one. Something you choose. Something that's yours." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he asked. Camille crossed the room and sat down beside him. "Because you spent a year paying for things I didn't know I was losing," she said. "And I want to spend a while paying them back. There is a category of sacrifice the world does not celebrate. It does not announce itself. It does not leave evidence that survives the morning news cycle. It happens in the dark, in parking garages, in quiet decisions made at kitchen tables, in a man sitting with a phone at 3 a.m. writing a message he will delete because the person it's addressed to cannot be allowed to know the truth. The people who make these sacrifices understand something the world's loudest achievers rarely stop long enough to learn. Some things are worth more than being seen. Some protection looks, from the outside, exactly like betrayal. And the most important thing you will ever do for someone you love may be the thing they cannot forgive you for, until the moment they finally understand what it was. Camille built a company worth $1 billion. The most valuable thing in it was never on any balance sheet. It was the man she had decided was too quiet. Who had spent a year in the dark, paying a cost she couldn't see, so that the life she had built would still be standing when the lights came back on. He never asked her to know. He never asked her to thank him. He just needed her to survive. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the people who show up quietly are often holding the most weight. And drop a comment telling us, have you ever misunderstood someone who was quietly protecting you? How long did it take to see it? We read every single one. We'll see you in the next one.